she lists her inspirations as Bertolt Brecht, Toni Morrison, and Richard Pryor. She earned theater degrees from Brown and Yale, but went to work for Amnesty International instead. Welcome to Women in Theater. I'm Linda Weiner, theater critic of Newsday, and our guest today is Lynn Nottage, whose restless, provocative intelligence has produced wildly contrasting, socially conscious plays about African American women. And they are mostly about women, right?
They are mostly about women.
Yeah.
That is definitely true.
Yeah. I was wondering, because all your plays, each one is a totally different world. Mm-hmm. Obviously, consciously done. Yes?
Yes, I describe myself as having sort of a nomadic imagination. And I grew up in sort of a middle-class neighborhood or a working-class neighborhood in New York, which was very multicultural. And I think that influenced my approach to writing, is that I was very curious about what was inside of all of those brownstones. And made it my mission when I was growing up to try and get into each person's house.
Oh, I love that.
And
this is in Brooklyn.
This is in Brooklyn,
yeah.
And I think I've been into just about every single house on my block, with the exception of maybe 5 or 6 of them.
And do they know that you're studying them for history, so that they'll be immortalized?
I don't think they do.
Just as well, right? When you did Intimate Apparel,
mm-hmm.
which I guess in terms of the most attention you've ever gotten for a play, right. It won just about every critic award nationally in New York that you can win. And it was last season, so that was 2003?
Yes.
A play, a very lyric, poetic play, heartbreaking, mm-hmm. has humor, but definitely about a turn-of-the-century seamstress who makes lingerie for both the brothels and the rich women on Fifth Avenue. So did you find then that people who hadn't known your work before would go to see Intimate Apparel, and then they think, oh, I like that poetic Lynn Nottage, I'll go to see all the rest of them?
Yeah, I think that was definitely the case, because I did Intimate Apparel at the Roundabout last season in 2003, 2004, and then immediately after I did Fabulation. In fact, Fabulation opened on the day that Intimate Apparel closed. And Fabulation is this very wild, fast-paced, funny play about a contemporary woman, whereas Intimate Apparel is a play set at the turn of the 20th century, from the 19th to 20th century, about a seamstress, and it's really about a meditation on loneliness. And so a lot of the audience that sort of fell in love with Intimate Apparel subsequently came to Fabulation and were shocked. But I think they were pleasantly shocked,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I think they enjoyed that play as much as they enjoyed Intimate Apparel, but for very different reasons.
And so you just have to train them.
Yes,
you have to train them that they won't know what to expect from a Lynn Nottage play.
Which I was actually really happy that the Fabulation came immediately on the heels of Intimate Apparel, because I didn't want to get stuck writing Intimate Apparel. I didn't want to get stuck with an audience that expects me only to write these very quiet, very sort of controlled lyrical plays.
The situation for women playwrights in general is really bad these days. You know, the percentage of women who are getting produced compared to the men who get produced. The bright spot the last several years is African American women.
I know, it's sort of wonderful,
isn't it?
Yeah.
What is this? Do you have any explanation?
Well, I think it's the sheer will and talent of the women who are getting produced. I think that it's a voice that hasn't been heard, and I think that there is a curiosity on the part of theaters, on the part of the audience, and I think that we know that women tend to go to theater more than men, and we know that black women tend to go to theater more than black men, so I think that it seems natural that there would be this desire to see our voices reflected on stage.
Well, that would make sense if it were true that therefore they produce more women because women go to the theater. But this is what always makes me crazy. Yeah. But it's been terrific. There's just so many really strong black women voices now. I have a quote from you that is, I had it, never mind. It was basically, you were talking about your voice and your mother's voice and the voice of your grandmother, and that all of these voices are within you, and these are stories that have not been told. How long has this taken you to sort of be able to know in your guts
to tell my family stories. For me, I think it's a really interesting journey, because I think when you begin writing, you begin by imitating others. And so the assumption is that I wasn't sure what my voice was, and I assumed that my voice was sort of Toni Morrison's voice or Alice Walker's voice, and I was trying to replicate that and tell these stories of Southern women. And what I realized is I had this real rich, wonderful literary legacy, in my own family. And I began to tell those stories. And in telling those stories, I think I've become much more successful. I mean, I think that Intimate Apparel is a direct outgrowth of being true to who I am and true to my own voice.
Was it loosely based on a seamstress in your family?
Yeah, it was inspired by my great-grandmother, who was a seamstress at the turn of the century, and she made Intimate Apparel. And she also began corresponding with a man on the Panama Canal, who she subsequently married.
And did it turn out badly?
They married. They had several children, but he died young. Oh. And so it turned out badly, but it's not the same story.
There's actually, you've said that one of the themes of my family is that we have generations of women abandoned by men.
It's true, except for my dad, who I have to say, God bless him, has remained.
Your dad, a psychologist in prison reform.
Yes.
And your mother, a principal?
She was a school teacher, and she actually became the principal of the school where she went to elementary school and where my grandmother went to elementary school in Bed-Stuy, which I find remarkable. Remarkable,
really. And in fact, in Fabulations, this is about a professional woman who was, flying high and basically forgot her roots and forgot her family, and then ends up going back to Brooklyn.
Right.
You went back to Brooklyn.
I did go back to Brooklyn, but I went back specifically to take care of my mother, who was at the time dying of Lou Gehrig's disease, which is ALS, and I was pregnant with my first child, and I thought this is probably the last opportunity for all of us to dwell in the same space. And so I ended up going back to my Brownstone, where I grew up, because when I left, I always assumed I'd never go back. I thought because I didn't want to make that circle, because so many of the people who I grew up with in my neighborhood just never leave. And I thought I've had the unique opportunity of experiencing many different things, and I didn't want that path to lead back to Brooklyn, but it did, and it's been wonderful.
And so you live on the top 2 floors, and your father lives on the...
My father lives downstairs.
And your daughter, Ruby?
She lives with us.
Is how old?
She's 7.
She's 7.
Yeah.
7. And so... Is the neighborhood very different from when you woke up? When you grew up?
It's incredibly different. Yeah, I mean, when I was growing up, it was the neighborhood that people passed through to get to other neighborhoods. And it had just been named. It was Boerum Hill, Brooklyn, which has sort of been immortalized in Jonathan Letham's fiction. My block was dominated by boarding houses. There was lots of prostitution, lots of drugs. It was a very diverse African-American, Latino neighborhood, and there were a few Irish families that had been there for a while, and it was always a neighborhood on the verge, which made it a very interesting neighborhood. But now, it's been completely gentrified.
Is it less interesting now?
For me, it's less interesting. It's like when I was growing up, there's a woman who lived next door to us who was sort of an Orthodox Muslim by day. I mean, she was completely shrouded from head to toe in black, but at night she was a prostitute. Ooh. And so she'd come out.
And if you told that in a play...
no one would believe me, but that was the sort of neighborhood that it was.
Yeah, if you wrote that in a play, I would review it and say, I don't believe this, right?
Yeah, but there were all those sort of characters, and it was very textured. Now, it's become sort of a Saab Volvo neighborhood where the neighbors don't sit on the stoop anymore. There are a few of us who are sort of diehard Brooklynites that in the summer sort of sit outside and barbecue, but we just don't know our neighbors in the same way.
Is it a theater-going neighborhood? Do you have the sense that people...
Well, they come and see my plays. They come and support me. But the wonderful thing about the neighborhood is now there are restaurants in walking distance. There's a supermarket. The corner bodega sells yogurt and things that you actually want.
And then high school, you would get on the A train
and go up to Music and Art, which
School of Music and Art,
which at the time was at 135th Street and Convent Avenue.
And how was it that you knew you wanted to do that?
To do music?
No, just
Yeah.
Go to a specialty school.
At the time, I was going to a smaller school, and I wanted a more expansive experience. And I went to a school that wasn't terribly diverse, and I wanted diversity. And I was someone who happened to play the piano pretty well. And I looked at my options, and music and art was one of them.
So do you ever want to write a musical? You did a children's musical,
I did a children's
right?
musical. I'd like to write a musical, yeah. I'd like to.
Because your characters are extremely musical anyway.
You know, and I thought Intimate Apparel would make an extraordinary opera.
It would be. A chamber opera, a wonderful chamber opera. Is it true that some guidance counselor told you that why don't you go to a state school, don't go to Brown?
That's absolutely true.
How could...
They told me that it was probably completely useless to apply to any Ivy League school, that I should probably apply to only state schools. And I said, well, you know what, I'm not. And I only applied to one school, which was Brown University, early action, and I got in, and then I slapped it on her desk and she said, you see? But you know, I feel like throughout my life I've been underestimated. I felt that way as a playwright early on in my career, is that people sort of underestimated where this journey would take me.
Well, there's something sort of delicious about it when you get there, though, right?
Yeah, it is. You know, it tastes that much better.
At Brown, did you study with Paula Vogel?
I did. She came to Brown the very last year that I was there, and she was wonderful, because up until that time, most of the theater artists that were teaching were academics. They're people who hadn't really been sort of practicing their trade, and Paula was like the first professional theater artist that I met at the university. And at the time, she wasn't the Paula Vogel that we know now. I mean, she was a female playwright, really sort of struggling and not having that much success. And but she brought this incredible energy. I don't know if she's been on this program.
We have. She was on the very. She was our first taping, our very first day.
I mean, she's very inspirational. She's a magnificent person, and she's a real, true nurturer. I mean, I think that she really enjoys teaching students, which is not true of a lot of the playwrights that I encountered who've taught.
Right. Do you teach?
I do. I teach at Yale. I teach the graduate students.
Oh, great.
In playwriting.
And so then you went to Yale, and then instead of going to the theater, what is this? I mean, I think it's fabulous, Amnesty International, but what possessed you?
Well, for me, I hadn't done anything else. It's like I went from high school to college to graduate school. I got to graduate school, and at the time for me, Yale was very difficult. New Haven was a city that was in transition. There wasn't a lot that was exciting going on. I didn't feel as a graduate student that integrated into the college. And also, I mean, I was only the second African-American woman to graduate from the playwriting department at Yale, and I didn't
Isn't that
feel
absurd?
Yeah, I mean,
Can you believe these? That we keep doing the. Well, I was the first woman. I was the first. This was is ridiculous.
And
yes.
This is in recent history.
Yes.
And so, and even though Lloyd Richards at the time was the dean, I still didn't feel
an African American director.
Director. I still didn't feel very much included in the community. I didn't feel supported by my professors. And so I thought at the end, it's like, do I want to do this? Is this going to be what I'm going to confront when I get out of graduate school in the theater world at large? And I wanted a different kind of experience. My parents were activists, and there was that side of myself that I felt needed to be nurtured. And so I applied for this job, and lo and behold, I got it at Amnesty International, which turns out to be one of the most formative and important formative experiences that I could have. I mean, I was the national press officer for 4 years.
Wow.
And so I ended up meeting, Nobel Peace Prize winners and doing a lot of wonderful advocacy work.
And how do you think it affected your plays?
Well, I think it affected who I am. Yeah. So I think that ultimately my plays reflect the Lynn that went through all of that education and then had a different kind of education.
Is the first play that you wrote after that was Poof?
Was Poof. I actually wrote it there.
You wrote it there.
Yeah.
Poof, 2 African-American women with a pile of ashes.
Yes.
They had abusive husbands who spontaneously combusted.
Well, one who she tells him to go to hell, and he does. He spontaneously combusts. It's really funny. I was just up at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, which is a maximum security prison for women, and it turns out that they had done Poof. And the woman who played one of the characters who sends her husband to hell had actually killed her husband, and she said it was incredibly cathartic to do this play.
And so much more fun.
And I found it really, I found it really funny. But I wrote Poof based upon some images that I'd seen while I was working in Amnesty. And at the time, Amnesty had a very strict mandate and was in the process of sort of expanding it to include more women's issues, but hadn't yet. And so I was feeling sort of frustrated that there were issues like domestic abuse that I couldn't address on a day-to-day basis. And so I saw these images and I thought, I want to do something, and hence Poof.
And it really, I know it's been translated into many languages. The idea that it's extremely popular in Asia.
In Asia and in Latin America as well.
Yeah, it's a lot of women wishing they could go Poof, huh?
Yeah.
That's really something. The plays have been so, at the beginning when I said wildly contrasting, I mean, really, both in terms of style and content. I think Poror Knockers.
Yep, Poror Knockers.
Poror Knockers, a satire about
it was
revolutionaries who are blowing up an FBI building.
Yes.
And then you had trouble getting it on after.
Well, I didn't. I mean, I didn't have trouble getting it.
Yeah.
On because I had originally done the play Poror Knockers, which is about a group of sort of radical Black nationalists who decide to blow up an FBI building and inadvertently kill some children in the process. And I originally had done the play at Dance Theater Workshop, which is a smaller space, and it was meant as a social satire, and it was very funny. And based upon that production, the Vineyard Theater decided to do it. But what happened in between the Vineyard Theater was Oklahoma City, which really changed, which changed it. And then the day we opened was the day of the week of the Million Man March on Washington, and I think that people were really sort of reluctant to embrace the play.
To get in the fun of it?
Well, not even the fun of it, but even to understand what it is I was trying to do. And I'm glad you brought up that play because I feel very passionately about it because I think that it was incredibly prescient. And I recently did a book reading and I read something out of Poror Knockers, and it just had such tremendous resonance for today. And that's what I was just trying to say, is that there's a lot of anger and frustration that the government doesn't recognize, and that people don't know why they're angry other than that they feel ignored, and they feel that their voices are not being included. And I think that we're seeing that played out.
Oh, yeah.
And people talk about political theater, and one of the things that I feel strongly about, and why I did Poror Knockers, I feel like the political theater shouldn't reinforce the status quo, that I think it should be pressing forward, it should be pushing the envelope.
And also entertaining.
And entertaining at the same time.
Yeah.
But I felt like with Poror Knockers, people weren't willing to embrace what it was saying, they just completely shut down. And, it sort of shocked me that after the play, which subsequently closed early, it was at the Vineyard, and is that we'd have these audience talkbacks and not a single person would stay to talk about it. And I thought, if it's angering you, or if it's frustrating you, or if you have questions, why don't you sit down and ask us and engage?
Stayed?
But no one would stay. I mean, Doug Abel, who's the artistic director, would bring a chair out, and he'd make the announcement at the curtain call, and then I'd sit down, and he'd sit down, and we'd sit there for 5 minutes, and then we'd get up and leave.
Well, that's sobering, isn't it? Wow.
Yeah, and it was interesting because there were people. Someone was calling in bomb threats to the theater, and so the police had to come and sweep it before the performers went on. It just affected the mood, but I thought, obviously it's gotten under the skin, so much so that it closed early.
Mud River Stone to Black American middle-class people go to Africa and are kidnapped.
Well, they're not kidnapped. They're
held hostage.
They're held hostage by the bellboy, which is redundant because they're trapped there by the rains. And he was a child soldier who, after the war, I sort of modeled it on Mozambique. He had been sucked into the war when he was 10 years old, a war that he never fully understood. He finds himself, after 9 years of fighting, not being skilled at anything else. And he was told when he was sucked into the war that he was going to be given grain and a blanket to take home to his mother. And 9 years later, he can't even deliver that. And so he ends up taking
these people hostage
to demand the United Nations.
But also then had to do with identity of Americans.
Americans,
you know, are you African? What are you?
Yeah, it's like everyone who enters into that hotel claims their Africanness, but this young man says, I am the only true African here, and I'm the only person who's suffering, and you choose not to recognize my humanity.
Have you been to Africa?
I have.
Yeah,
I have.
And is there what's the identity like for you? I mean, do you feel, yes, I understand it here, or I'm an ugly American? I mean, is there...
Well, it's interesting because I had two very different experiences. I went to West Africa. I went to Senegal and Gambia, and that was really a wonderful, emotional experience. I found that the culture was vibrant and the people incredibly warm, and there were things that seemed very familiar to me. And this past summer, I went to Uganda, which is in Central East Africa, and it was very different. That the people were much more reserved. And granted, I mean, it's a country that's been in the midst of a civil war for 17 years and has a benevolent dictator, and it's, you know, it's sort of circled by the Sudan, the Congo, and Rwanda, and so I can imagine that the people are tense, but I felt very much of a foreigner in that country, and I also felt that I was treated that way.
Has anyone produced Las Meninas?
Las Meninas.
Meninas?
Yes.
Yes? Where was it
finally.
done?
It was done at San Jose Rep in a very handsome operatic production.
Could you briefly tell a little bit of that? It's such a fascinating idea for a play.
Las Meninas is the true story of the romance between the Queen of France, the wife of Louis XIV, the magnificent Sun King, and an African dwarf named Nabu, who was given to her as a gift. And I say true because I did extensive research, and I found that this was the case. And they had a daughter who was put in a convent where she lived for her entire life.
Your plays deal a lot with identity, with to be successful, do you really have to declare that your parents are dead, which is what Undine did in Fabulation. And there was this lovely quote from you where you said, how I identify myself changes depending where I am in the room. Could you explain that a little more?
Well, it's just, you know, it's like when you're in a room full of men, I'm a woman. And when I'm in a room full of white women, I'm an African-American woman. You know, so it's just, it sort of shifts according to the context and how loudly I have to declare who I am.
Things coming up in the future?
I have, I don't have anything.
No, you do.
I do. What do I have?
You have a Mother Courage in Uganda.
No, I don't.
You're not
anymore.
doing it?
No.
Went away.
It went away, unfortunately. Right. Some issues. I do have that play still, and I still have the idea, but unfortunately, it won't be inspired by Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage.
An adaptation of Enemy of the People?
No.
Not going to do it?
No, not going to do it.
Actually, in both ways, I was thinking, why is she doing adaptations? Why? Because you're so original. You do so much really original stories.
Well, I can tell you, I mean, with Mother Courage, it's because I'm so inspired by that central character. And it wasn't going to be a literal adaptation, but I wanted to use her as a model. And I was going to set it in the Congo, but I still am going to write a play about an African woman caught in the middle of warfare in the Congo. It's just not going to be based on the Mother Courage character. But, you know, I have a couple of plays that I'm developing, and I write my plays in my head, so they're there, and it's really difficult for me to sort of talk about them before.
I can't even tell anybody when I thought of a play before I write about it, so I can imagine. Your husband is also a writer?
He's a filmmaker. He's a director and a screenwriter.
Tom Gerker.
Tony.
Tony Gerber.
You
do it. He's Tony your husband. Gerber. You know his name.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
He's an.
And did you work together on a movie?
Yeah, we made a film called Side Streets about 7 years ago.
And how'd you meet?
We met in college, so we've been together for a really long time.
If you could snap your fingers right now and change anything for women in the theater. Not necessarily African-American women in theater, just snap your fingers and make it better, what would you do?
I think that I'd make more artistic directors. I think the fact that there's so few women in theater is the fact that there's so few women running theaters. Yeah. So I think that that would really make a difference. And you know, the other thing that I think I would do if I could have 2 snaps.
You can have 2 snaps.
Would have there be more women who are writing about theater, more critics, because I also think that affects women. Because by and large, I don't think that women get as good reviews, and I don't know why that is the case, but I think that it's true. I think that men have an advantage when they're reviewing male plays, and women are at a disadvantage because, you know, by and large, their work is being interpreted by men. Yeah, and so those would be my 2 snaps.
Yeah, I thank you for including me in your snap there. I appreciate that very much. Our time is going by so quickly, I can't believe it, but I want to really thank you so much, Lynn Nottage, for being here, and thank you for being here. On behalf of the League of Professional Theater Women, I'm Linda Weiner, and this has been Women in Theater.